There's an old book, mostly forgotten now, that once guided daughters through the quiet rituals of life. When to rise, how to serve, what kind of silence to keep. But those teachings weren't all rules and riddles. Some became stories, and the stories were never just about tea or stitches or sunrise. Tonight we open two such pages and listen in. This is the classic on ladyhood. Take heed and listen carefully. In the quiet hills of Wensleydale, where the mist rolled in like cream over tea and the sheep knew their names, there stood an old stone cottage surrounded by wild rose bushes and a garden that never gave more than it had to. Clara was 11 when her parents sent her to live with her grandmother, a thin woman with silver hair pinned in coils like pastries and a voice softer than the morning fog. Her father had said it would be just for a little while, though neither of them explained why. Clara arrived in April, when the lambs were still wobbling and the earth smelled new. Her grandmother met her at the gate without fanfare. "I suppose you've grown since I saw you last," the old woman said, not smiling exactly, but not frowning either. "You'll find your place soon enough." Inside the cottage, everything felt like it had been waiting. The chair by the fire had its cushion fluffed. The window panes gleamed, and beside the hearth lay a basket of gray yarn, always with a new ball forming and a pair of needles never far from reach. That night, and every night after, Clara sat near the fire while her grandmother knitted. The needles clicked gently in rhythm with the wind tapping the shutters. Nothing was ever explained directly, not why her parents were gone, nor how long she'd stay. But in the silences, her grandmother told other things. "You must rinse your teacup with hot water before the tea goes in," she said once. "Never speak about someone unless you first prayed for them. Fold your grief like linens, neat, quiet, and kept where it won't wrinkle your temper." These weren't rules exactly. They were offerings, quietly placed in front of Clara like jam on toast. At first, Clara thought they were strange. She had expected her grandmother to speak of school, or chores, or letters from home, but none of that came. What came were evenings of stories, not adventures but small remembrances. How her own mother once cried because she dropped a pie before guests arrived. How Clara's grandfather used to tie his boots with the same knot every morning, like a ritual for facing the world. Over time, Clara learned the rhythm of the place. She fed the chickens without being told. She wiped the table twice, once with vinegar, once with a dry cloth. She swept the doorstep in wide arcs, like her grandmother had shown her. And in that stillness, something grew, not knowledge, but knowing. It wasn't loud or fast. It came slowly, like ivy curling around stone. One morning in late summer, Clara's parents wrote to say they were coming to take her home. She read the letter once, then again. She thought she would feel relief. Instead, she felt like someone had handed her back a coat that no longer fit. That evening, she stood beside her grandmother as they picked herbs for drying. "Will you miss me?" Clara asked. Her grandmother didn't answer right away. Then, still facing the garden, she said, "The fire doesn't miss the flame. It remembers it." That night, the knitting resumed. Clara sat close, and for the first time she saw the pattern. An intricate lace shawl, soft as cloud and warm as dusk. Her grandmother had been knitting it the entire time. "Is that for you?" Clara asked. "No, it's for whoever listens." When Clara returned to her parents in September, she packed little. Her books had stayed dusty. Her shoes no longer pinched, but the shawl came with her, folded carefully in brown paper and tied with twine. Years passed. Clara became a teacher, then a mother. Her own daughter was quick-witted, restless, never still. Clara tried rules, schedules, rewards, nothing quite worked. Until one evening, worn down by the day's chaos, she lit a fire, took out an old pair of needles, and began to knit. Her daughter wandered in. "What are you making?" Clara smiled. "A place to listen." And from that night on, they sat together. Not every evening, but often enough. And Clara began to speak in stories. Of her grandmother, of roses that bloomed even in wind. Of the kind of love that doesn't knock, but waits. And sometimes, when her daughter asked a question Clara couldn't answer, she simply replied, "This is the classic on ladyhood. Take heed and listen carefully." Get up early in the morning and depart from your virgin's chamber. Cook the soup of tea to serve your parents in honor. Before dawn, the mist still hugged the cobblestones of Faroe Glen, like a shawl too heavy to lift, and the crows on the church steeple had not yet begun their quarrels. In a narrow cottage nestled near the market road, 16-year-old Elsie Tamsen tied her apron before the first robin sang. She had never been the first to wake, not until that spring. Her mother had fallen ill 3 weeks earlier, and her father, a mill worker with rough hands and quiet eyes, had taken to speaking in a voice more hushed than usual. It was Elsie's younger brother Jamie who had asked plainly at supper one night, "If Mom's resting, who'll make the morning tea?" No one had answered. The question had fallen like a seed into the table's wooden grain, and the next morning Elsie woke before light. She didn't do it out of duty, at least, not at first. She did it because the house felt paused, like a song waiting for its next note. And perhaps because she dreamt of her mother standing in the doorway of the kitchen, smiling without saying a word. So she rose. The first time she burned the leaves. The second time she scalded her hand. But by the third morning, she'd found her rhythm. Warming the pot, measuring the leaves, pouring gently so the aroma rose like a kind of blessing. Each morning became a quiet ritual. Heat, steep, serve. She would carry the tea to her father, already dressed for work, and then to her mother, propped gently with pillows. Jamie still slept, Elsie like that, being the only soul awake, like she was tending to something older than the family itself. As days passed, Elsie added more to her mornings. Oatmeal stirred with honey, fresh bread wrapped in cloth, a damp cloth placed gently on her mother's forehead before the light turned gold outside. It was never asked of her. It simply became hers. One day her aunt came to visit, a sharp woman with expensive gloves and opinions about everything. She sniffed the bread, sipped the tea, and said, "When did Elsie turn into a little housekeeper?" Her father had smiled then, only slightly, and replied, "When no one else could." That night, as the fire died low, her mother called Elsie to her side. Her voice was thin as paper, but kind. "You don't need to keep doing all this," she whispered, but Elsie only tucked the blankets tighter and said, "I know, that's why I do." In the weeks that followed, her mother began to sit up more often. She taught Elsie how to tell if the tea was too bitter just by its color, how to stretch a meal when guests came unexpected, how to hold silence without letting it become awkward. Then came a morning when Elsie's mother was the one at the stove, not strong, but steady, and she poured the tea for her daughter, who sat surprised, hands still red from the morning's chores. They sipped together in silence. Outside, the mist began to lift. Years later, when Elsie had a home of her own and 2 daughters with the same thick curls she once brushed from her mother's brow, she still rose before the sun. Not always because she had to, but because she remembered what it meant. A girl's love, she had learned, wasn't always spoken. Sometimes it was steeped in tea. Stories like these weren't always told to entertain. Sometimes they were told to remember, sometimes just to listen. If you'd like to hear more whispers from The Lady's Book, stay close, subscribe, and the stories will find you, just as they always have. Imagine you are a young lady in a world long before ours. In the hush of early morning, you rise to wash, comb your hair, and greet the day with grace. Or perhaps you're in the warm glow of an evening fire, the steady rhythm of your needle stitching patience into every seam. These were not just tasks, they were the very language of ladyhood, treasured in homes from the Nile's golden banks to the bustling streets of Babylon. Tonight we open the Lady's Book of Ancient Wisdom, where every page holds a story to soothe the mind, warm the heart, and carry you into gentle dreams. Be diligent in combing your hair and washing your body, and pursue cleanness and tidiness in general. The sun had not yet risen over the city of Thebes, but the air already carried the faint scent of the river, cool, silvery, and deep. Nephura opened her eyes to the faint glow of the oil lamp in her small chamber, its wick burning low. She lay still for a moment, listening. Somewhere beyond the walls of the palace, an ibis cried, and far off, the splash of oars reached her ears. Today, like every day, she would serve in the household of Queen Henut, wife of Pharaoh. But Nephura had learned something in her short time here. In the palace, appearances mattered almost as much as the work one did. The queen noticed everything, not just the cleanliness of her chambers, but the posture of the servants, the smoothness of their hair, the way they carried themselves through the halls. Nephura rose quietly and unrolled the reed mat that served as her floor covering. She took the clay jar from its place in the corner and poured water into the wide washing bowl. The water was cool against her skin as she rinsed her face, her arms, her hands. She rubbed her skin gently with a small piece of natron soap, breathing in its faint mineral scent. Then she reached for the wooden comb her mother had given her before she left for Thebes. As she drew the comb through her black hair, she remembered her mother's words, thoughtful. To be clean is to show respect, to the gods, to others, and to yourself. Never let the dust of the road or the weariness of the day make you careless. The queen's servants were not given the finest oils, but Nephura had managed to trade a small bundle of figs for a vial of blue lotus oil. She dabbed a drop at her temples, letting the rich, floral aroma mingle with the morning air. Once she had dressed in her simple but spotless linen tunic, she turned to her chamber. The bedroll was smooth flat, her sandals placed neatly side by side, the small amulet of Hathor on the wall wiped free of dust. Even here, in the smallest corners of the palace, there was no excuse for disorder. By mid-morning, the air was already warm, and the palace hummed with preparations. Nephura carried a tray of fresh bread through the colonnade, careful not to spill a single crumb. The scent of honey and coriander clung to the loaves, and from somewhere nearby came the faint trill of a flute, mingling with the rhythmic thud of pestles grinding herbs. Servants hurried past in every direction, one balancing a basket of figs, another carrying folded linen robes for the queen's handmaidens. Beyond the pillared walkway, the great courtyard shimmered in the sunlight, its flagstones hot enough to make bare feet dance. As Nephura stepped into the open space, she paused for a breath, tilting her face toward the brightness. But in that instant, she noticed something strange. The sharp blue of the morning sky was fading, as if brushed over by a dusty veil. The wind shifted. First a whisper, tugging at the edges of her robe, then a sigh that rattled the palm fronds overhead. She tightened her grip on the tray and quickened her pace. A low murmur spread among the servants. Some shaded their eyes, looking toward the desert beyond the palace walls. Nephura followed their gaze, and her breath caught. On the horizon, a wall of copper-colored haze was rising, thick and solid as if the land itself had been torn up and hurled toward them. The first sting of grit brushed her cheek. "Sandstorm!" someone shouted. Chaos bloomed instantly. A scribe dropped his scrolls, their careful ink smudging as they tumbled across the stones. The fig basket tipped, fruit rolling underfoot. A garland maker cried out as her flowers scattered into the wind. Nephura ducked her head and ran, the bread tray clutched to her chest. The air grew heavier, grittier, until her eyes watered. In the courtyard, guards struggled to push the heavy bronze gates shut, their voices muffled by the roar of the wind. But the storm was quicker. The first great gust swept into the palace, flinging sand through the colonnade like a spray of needles. By the time she reached the queen's chambers, her robe was dusted in ochre and her hair tangled. The room itself was dim, the light choked by the swirling haze outside. Queen Henut sat by the window, her expression calm but her eyes sharp as she assessed the damage. "We go before the people in an hour," she said evenly. "We cannot appear as beggars covered in sand." Around her, the other attendants looked defeated. Sand clung to their robes, streaked their faces, and dulled the shine of every ornament. A golden mirror lay on the floor, its surface clouded. Nephura hesitated only a moment before setting down the bread. She found the washing basin in the corner, still half full from the morning. She fetched the last jar of clean water from the storeroom and poured it carefully. Then she knelt before the queen, rinsed a linen cloth, and began wiping the dust from her face with slow, deliberate strokes. Her hands moved without pause, combing the queen's hair strand by strand, brushing sand from the fine folds of her robe. The other attendants watching her work seemed to stir from their despair. They began to copy her motions, shaking out garments, polishing jewelry, smoothing the floor coverings. Outside, the wind still moaned through the high windows, but inside the queen's chamber, order was returning. By the time the storm's howl faded, the room smelled faintly of lotus oil instead of grit. The queen rose, radiant once more, and her household followed her into the festival square as if the desert itself had bowed aside to let them pass. The festival square still bore traces of the storm. Sand lay in pale drifts at the base of statues, and the bright pennants that had once streamed overhead now hung heavy and still. Yet, when the queen stepped into the open, the crowd gasped, not at the wreckage but at her. She shone like the morning star. Not a fleck of grit marred her face, not a thread of her linen robe was out of place. The gold at her wrist caught the sunlight, scattering it like sparks across the assembly. A laka murmur spread through the people, and soon the murmur became cheers. To them, her immaculate appearance meant one thing, that she was untouched by the chaos of the desert, favored by the gods themselves. Nephura kept to the side of the procession, clutching the empty water jar she had used. She watched as the queen greeted the temple priests, offered the bread she had carried through the storm, and raised her voice in blessing. Only once did the queen glance toward her, but it was enough. Her eyes softened for a moment, and a subtle tilt of her head conveyed what no public words could say. When the ceremony ended, the crowd dispersed slowly, reluctant to let the queen's presence fade. The high steward approached Nephura and pressed a small bundle into her hands. Inside was a comb of ivory, polished smooth, and a vial of fragrant myrrh oil. "Her Majesty says," the steward murmured, "that those who keep order in the storm are the ones who deserve the gifts of peace." That night, as the palace settled into quiet, Nephura placed the ivory comb on her low table. The myrrh's scent drifted through her small room, warm and comforting. She thought of the sandstorm's roar, of the grit stinging her eyes, and of the queen's shining face in the square, and she smiled. Learn needlework and do not be lazy. In the city of Babylon, where the river carried both wealth and whispers, lived a merchant named Bel-Shumar. His ships brought him spices from the east, copper from the mountains, and rare purple dye from far-off Tyre. His home stood at the end of a quiet street, with tall wooden doors painted deep red, and within its courtyard, the scent of figs and dates hung heavy in the warm air. Bel-Shumar had one daughter, Samira. She was fair and bright-eyed, and her father loved her dearly. Yet, for all her charm, she had a habit her mother frowned upon. She avoided the work of her hands. The household women spun thread, wove cloth, and stitched garments, but Samira would slip away to the roof to watch the riverboats glide past, her thoughts adrift like the sails in the wind. One afternoon, word arrived that the king himself would pass through the merchant's quarter in 3 days' time. Bel-Shumar's household prepared as though for a feast. Servants polished bronze bowls until they shone like the sun. Musicians were hired, and Samira's mother laid out her daughter's finest robe, dyed in the precious Tyrian purple her father had traded for with half a year's profit. But when her mother unfolded it, she gasped. The hem was torn, the threads loose as if gnawed by time itself. The robe had been stored poorly, left to catch on a splinter of the cedar chest. "Samira," her mother said, her voice low but sharp, "this must be mended. No servant's hands will do for such a robe. You must stitch it yourself, for the eyes of Babylon will be upon you." Samira's stomach sank. She had never finished a piece of needlework without making the stitches crooked or leaving the thread too tight. But her mother placed the robe and a basket of silk thread in her lap and left her in the courtyard. The hours stretched long. Samira pricked her fingers more than once. She thought of leaving the work to someone else, but her mother's words echoed in her mind. So she worked slowly, knot by knot, smoothing each stitch, undoing the ones that looked wrong, and starting again. By nightfall, her hands ached, and the moon was high. She held the hem up to the lamplight. It was not perfect, but the silk caught the glow, each stitch neat enough to pass a mother's inspection. The day of the king's procession arrived. The streets were a river of people, their voices 1,000 ripples. Samira stood beside her father at the gate, the purple robe falling in perfect folds. As the king's chariot passed, he looked their way, and for the briefest moment, his gaze lingered, not on the gold of her father's signet ring, nor the fine silver cups on display, but on the young woman in the purple robe with the proud, unflinching posture. That evening, after the last guest had gone and the house was quiet again, Bel-Shumar came to Samira's room. In his hand, he held a small cedar box. Inside lay a pair of golden needles, their eyes smooth and shining. "For the girl," he said, "who mended more than a robe today." Samira smiled, running her fingers over the needles. She understood now, needlework was not just cloth and thread, but patience, care, and the quiet pride of creating something worth wearing before kings. And that night, she dreamed not of idle riverboats, but of fabrics she had yet to sew, robes yet to stitch, and the gentle sound of her golden needles passing through silk. And so, in both Egypt and Babylon, wisdom found its way into daily life, whether through a comb and a wash basin, or a needle and a spool of silk. If you enjoyed these gentle journeys into the past, I invite you to stay with me for more stories like this. You can subscribe so the next time the ancient world has something to share, you'll be here to listen. Until then, sleep well, dream kindly, and carry a little bit of that old world wisdom into your tomorrow. Imagine the moonlight glinting off a lacquered rooftop, the hush of a paper-walled home, and the distant echo of temple bells. Tonight, we drift into two tales from an ancient land, one of whispered counsel beneath the cherry moon, and another of flickering firelight where caution and care keep the night safe. Settle in, breathe deep, and let these old-world whispers carry you into gentle dreams. Do not speak at the rebuke of parents. Ask for exhortation in the presence of your brother and his wife. On the shore of a quiet bay stood a reed-thatched house where fishermen mended nets and gulls wrote white lines across the morning. In that house lived Kaiko with her parents, her elder brother Taro, and Taro's wife Aya. Kaiko loved songs, river songs, rice planting songs, songs the traveling shamisen player left behind like footprints. She sang while sweeping, sang while rinsing rice, and sometimes forgetfully, sang instead of sweeping or rinsing at all. One afternoon, after a long day on the water, Kaiko's father found the water jars unfilled and the floor unswept. His words were not cruel, but they struck like oars against a dock. "You have a good voice," he said, "but a house needs hands." Heat rose to Kaiko's face. "You only praise nets and jars. What of songs?" Her mother's eyes cooled. "When you are admonished, bow first, words later." Kaiko stormed out toward the pines beyond the rice fields, where the wind combs the needles into a hush. There she met an old woman in a cloak of woven reeds, sitting on a driftwood log as if she had been waiting forever. The woman turned a reed between her fingers and spoke without looking up. "Ears are gates," the old woman murmured. "If you bar them, no blessing enters." Kaiko frowned. "Everyone says to listen, but no one tells me how." The woman nodded, patient as a tide. From the reed she had been turning, she knotted a small loop and pressed it into Kaiko's palm. "A knot holds because both ends agree to bend. Go to Taro and Aya. Ask them how your parents' temper turns with the day." Kaiko returned at dusk. Pride prickled, but the reed knot in her hand felt warm. She bowed to Taro and Aya. "Teach me, when father is weary, what words soothe? When mother rebukes me, how should I answer?" Aya smiled, drawing Kaiko beside the brazier. She showed her how to kneel with the body's weight gently folded, how to steady the breath before speaking, how to pour tea for a tired father so the steam rose first toward him, how to answer rebuke with, "I receive it," and only afterwards ask, "Please show me the better way." Taro, who knew their parents' tides, taught the hours to bring requests and the hours to bring silence, and how to let a face be calm even when the heart is not. The very next morning, the test arrived. A sudden squall pinned the fishing boats to shore. Market folk crowded into their house for shelter. Keiko, hurrying, salted the soup twice. Her mother tasted, winced, and in front of the guests spoke sharply, "Child, your rush is a broom that only spreads the dirt." Keiko felt the old heat climb her throat. Her fingers tightened around the ladle. But Aya's hand brushed her sleeve, a reminder. And Keiko remembered the reed knot waiting in her sleeve like a second pulse. She bowed from the knees. I receive it. Please show me the better way. Her mother's face softened, as if a wind had shifted. Water, then kelp. We can save it. Together they did. People ate, faces warmed. The storm rattled and moved on. That night, the moon poured milk onto the bay. Keiko walked to the pines to return the reed knot, but the old woman was already there, standing where land becomes sand. You listen, the woman said. Now your house will listen to you, in time. Who are you? Keiko asked. The woman lifted her reed cloak. For a blink, Keiko glimpsed a shimmer like river light and the shape of a heron. Only the one who keeps this shore, the woman said. Houses have roofs. Villages have guardians. When rebuke comes, bow and ask. Asking is how doors open. Seasons turned. Keiko learned the folds of her parents' moods like a map. Her songs did not stop, but now they landed gently on finished chores. When a suitor came from a neighboring inlet, Keiko poured tea the way Aya had taught her. Steam toward the weary, silence toward the proud. Her parents nodded without words. On the morning she left for her new home, Keiko placed the reed knot on the lintel of the old door. Wind threaded through it and sang. In the pines, a heron lifted, circled once, and was gone. Handle carefully when it comes to fire and candles. In the city tucked between river and hill stood the house of Hideo, the lacquer merchant, its beams black as wet ink. Paper doors slid like clouds. Silk banners swayed in the courtyard. Hideo's daughter, Sayo, was quick with sums and quicker with laughter, but candles made her nervous. The house was all wood and paper. One careless spark and the moon would be looking at empty air. Do not fear fire, said Grandmother Yon, whose hair was the color of ash. Respect it. Fear makes clumsy hands. She showed Sayo the hearth's grammar. Ash bed, coal nest. The circle cleared to bare clay. A lidded water jar beside every flame, the way to pinch a wick until it sighed into darkness. Soon came the festival of lanterns. The neighborhood would hang strings of paper lights along the street. Hideo wanted his house to glow like a floating palace. Sayo was charged with tending the courtyard lanterns and the altar candle for the house kami. It is an honor, said her father, pressing a flint and steel into her palm. And a gravity? The afternoon before the festival, a charcoal seller hobbled into the yard, leaning on a staff wrapped with old hemp. His eyes were bright as cinders. Good child, he rasped, buy poor charcoal, and it sulks. Buy proud charcoal, and it climbs. Here, feel the weight. He placed a briquette in Sayo's hand. It was warm as a sleeping sparrow. Fire is a guest. Ask it, don't order it. Sayo bowed and bought a sack. When she looked up from counting coins, the old man had vanished. No footprints on the dust, just a smell of rain where there were no clouds. Dusk fell like ink into water. Sayo kindled the first lantern. It bloomed with a soft belly of light. Then the second, then the third. The street was soon a river of small suns, and the neighbors' laughter ran along it like fish. In the inner hall, she lit the altar candle and whispered the family prayer, as Yone had taught her. Kagutsuchi no Kami, flame that warms rice and seals lacquer, be gentle in this house. Wind rose, one of those sly, dry breaths that creep down from the hills in late summer. A banner snapped. A lantern bobbed hard against its cord. Sayo set sandpots at the corners, weighted the cords, checked the lids on the water jars. Carefully, she trimmed the altar candle's wick and lowered the flame to a steady blush. Then came the drum parade, all bronze and thunder. Boys ran whooping beneath the lantern strings. A dancer clipped the line with the end of his staff, just enough to send a lantern spinning wildly. It tore free, skittered across the courtyard stones, and crashed against the threshold of the storehouse. In a heartbeat, the straw mat caught, then the dry fringe of a broom, small tongues of orange licking upward, eager. Sayo did not scream. She moved the way Yoni had moved when teaching. Step, breathe, decide. She kicked the burning mat away from the doorway to bare earth, overturned the nearest water jar to drown the broom, smothered the lantern frame with a damp cloth she kept for that purpose. The flame coughed, brightened, died, brightened again, then went out with a stubborn hiss. Smoke rode a crooked line into the night and faded. Neighbors rushed in with clattering buckets, faces hot with fear and praise. Hideo grabbed Seo's shoulders, searching her for burns. "You were quicker than wind," he said, voice shaking. Yone only nodded, the way old trees nod to thunder they have already survived. Seo cleaned the blackened threshold and relit one small lantern, setting it low in a clay bowl, a pool of light tamed by earth. She returned to the altar and bowed. The candle flame leaned as if listening. In the silence that followed, Seo heard again the charcoal seller's voice. "Fire is a guest." Later, when the drums had passed and the street was a constellation of sighing paper moons, the charcoal seller appeared once more by the gate. Only this time his staff smoked at the tip without burning, and the air around him tasted like iron after lightning. "You kept the fire's pride from becoming anger," he said. "Good." He tapped his staff on the threshold. The char stain brightened, then sank into the wood until the mark was neat and dark as lacquer, no longer a wound. Remember 3. Ash for bed, water for courtesy, clay for boundary. Seo bowed low, and when she dared to look up, there was only a red dragonfly hovering where the old man had stood. It darted toward the altar candle, then away, as if bowing to it in turn. In years to come, Hideo's house became known for its light, never gaudy, always calm. Travelers said the lanterns there seemed to breathe with the night instead of against it. Seo married, and on festival evenings she taught her own daughter the grammar of flame, how to pinch a wick, where to set a jar, how to let a candle glow like a guest who means to stay and brings no trouble. And when the wind prowled dry from the hills, a dragonfly sometimes rode it, red as a coal, keeping watch. Thank you for journeying with me into these quiet corners of ancient Japan. If these stories brought you a moment of peace or sparked a dream or two, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe and join me again. There are many more nights, many more stories, and countless dreams waiting to be told. Imagine you are sitting by a fire under the vast African sky. The drums echo softly in the distance, and the stories of old begin to rise with the smoke. Tonight we'll hear 2 tales, one of humility in wearing old clothes as though new, and one of reverence in keeping clean when we prepare food for those we love. These stories, drawn from ancient wisdom, remind us that small acts of care carry the weight of honor, and that even in the quiet of daily life, the ancestors are watching. So settle down, breathe deeply, and let the stories guide you toward gentle dreams. Wear old clothes as new. Long ago, when the great river sang louder than the voices of men, and the plains trembled under the feet of migrating herds, there lived a humble family in a small riverside village. The father was a potter, shaping clay jars that carried water and grain. The mother was a weaver, braiding reeds into mats and baskets strong enough to last for years. Their home smelled of fire smoke, clay, and river water. Their daughter Amara was bright as dawn, with eyes that often lingered on things beyond her reach. Though her parents clothed her with love, she longed for more: the shimmer of new fabric, the brightness of jewels, the admiration of the crowd. Every year, the Festival of Drums arrived like the flood of the river. Traders brought silks from the coast, spices from the desert, and beads from faraway lands. The young women of the village would gather in the circle, dressed in robes that seemed to catch fire under the torchlight, while the men beat rhythms on the great high drums until the stars themselves seemed to dance. Amara's robe was different. It was a deep indigo cloth that had belonged to her mother when she was a girl. Though patched many times, it was always washed carefully, the dye preserved, the tears mended with patience. But to Amara, it looked plain. She would watch as other maidens twirled with bracelets that jingled and cloths that glittered, and her heart would ache with envy. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and the frogs began their chorus, Amara sat with her mother by the fire. The robe lay folded on her lap, smelling of soap and wood smoke. "Mother," she whispered, "please let me have a new dress. Just this once. I want to be like the daughters of the merchants, to shine so bright that all eyes will turn to me." Her mother paused, her needle stilling mid-stitch. "Child," she said gently, "you do not understand. This robe is not old, it carries life. Your grandmother spun the thread with her own hands. Your aunt dyed it with indigo gathered by the river. I wore it when I first danced before your father. Every patch is a mark of survival, through flood, through hunger, through years of toil. To wear it is to wear the strength of your people. Treat it as new, and you will shine more than the richest silk." But Amara frowned. To her young heart, these words seemed like consolation, not truth. When the festival came, the village blazed with light. Fires roared and the drums began. Low at first, then rising like thunder. The maidens stepped into the circle, one by one. The merchant's daughter wore a robe threaded with gold. She spun proudly, but the fabric was fragile. With one sharp move, the seam split across her side. Gasps echoed. She stumbled, covering herself, and fled in tears. Another maiden's beads snapped mid-dance, scattering like seeds across the ground. Another tripped when her stiff new sandals broke. One by one, the ornaments of vanity betrayed them. Then the drums fell silent. All eyes turned to Amara. She stepped into the circle, trembling, her patched indigo robe hanging plain against her body. The crowd whispered, but when the drums struck again, something changed. Amara moved with grace, born not of glitter, but of strength. The robe flowed around her like water, catching the firelight in its deep blue folds. Where others had stumbled, she was steady. Where others had frayed, her garment held strong. The people began to clap in rhythm, their voices rising. By the time she finished, the elders were nodding, the children were cheering, and even the proud maidens could not deny the beauty that had emerged from what they thought was plain. When the dance ended, an old woman, a storyteller with hair white as river foam, stepped forward. Her voice cut through the night. "Child, you have learned what many forget. Clothes do not shine by newness, but by the spirit stitched into them. This robe carries the hands of your mothers, the wisdom of your grandmothers, the care of your family. You honored it, and it honored you." Amara's heart swelled with shame and joy. She ran home and knelt before her parents. "Now I see," she whispered. "Old clothes, cared for, are not old. They are like the wisdom of our elders, never faded, always new." From that day, Amara no longer envied the silks of the wealthy. She learned to patch the robe herself, weaving her own patience into its fabric. Years later, when she had daughters of her own, she taught them the same. Care for what you are given. Honor what has endured. To wear the old as new is to walk with the strength of your people. The robe passed down through generations until it was no longer seen as cloth at all, but as a relic of resilience. And so, in the village by the river, the proverb endured: "Wear old clothes as new, and they will never betray you." Be clean and tidy when you make tea or meals. In the rolling savannas where the winds carried the songs of drums and the earth glowed red beneath the sun, lay a village called Kijiji Chamoyo, the village of the heart. At the center of the village grew a baobab tree, so ancient that the people said it had stood since the first dawn. Its roots coiled deep into the ground, like the arms of ancestors embracing the living, and the elders taught that its trunk carried the whispers of the spirits. The baobab was not just a tree, it was the soul of the people. Every judgment, celebration, and oath was made under its shade. Beneath its branches, children learned their first lessons, lovers spoke their first promises, and chiefs spoke their last words. In this village lived Nia, a girl with a lively spirit. Her laugh was bright as river water, her voice quick as a sparrow's call. Yet though she was full of kindness, she lacked discipline. When she cooked, she left ashes scattered, pots blackened and water spilled. When she brewed tea, her hands were careless, and though her food tasted well enough, the process dishonored the gift. Her mother, a strong woman named Asha, often rebuked her. "Nia, my child, do not only feed the body, feed the spirit. The pot that is dirty cooks shame. The hearth that is untidy calls no blessing." But Nia only smiled, thinking these were the words of an old woman too strict for the world of youth. When the rains blessed the land and millet rose high, the people prepared for the feast of the first harvest. This was the most sacred celebration of the year. It was a time when songs echoed through the hills, when men returned from the hunt with antelope and gazelle, when women prepared stews that filled the air with spice and promise. But more than food, it was a time of honor. Each family presented offerings to the ancestors, offerings judged not only by taste, but by the care, cleanliness, and reverence with which they were made. For the people believed, the ancestors do not eat smoke or soot, they do not drink muddied water, they receive only the purity of clean hands and a careful heart. This year, Nia's family was chosen to present the welcome meal, the first dish placed before the elders beneath the baobab. It was the highest honor and the greatest test. Her mother, though cautious, gave the task to Nia, hoping this might awaken responsibility in her daughter. Asha told her, "The eyes of the ancestors are sharp. They see what spills on the ground. They see the soot on your pots. Do not dishonor them." Nia bowed, but in her heart she thought, what matters is flavor, not fuss. Why waste time on small things? On the morning of the feast, Nia rose with the sun. She hurried to grind millet, but she let husks scatter into the dust. She fetched water from the river, but allowed mud to slip into the calabash. She cut goat meat, but left bones and scraps strewn across the ground. Her fire roared too hot, blackening the clay pot, and smoke stung her eyes. As she bent over the bubbling stew, a shadow fell across her hearth. A stranger had come, tall, wrapped in a cloak of woven grass, his staff carved with twisting patterns. His eyes glowed like embers, steady and burning. He said in a voice low as thunder in the distance, "Daughter, why do you scatter the gifts of the earth? Why do you treat food like dust beneath your feet? The millet you waste could feed a child. The water you spill could quench a thirst. Do you not know that every grain, every drop, carries the blessing of the ancestors?" Naya, startled, answered quickly, "But the food will still taste good. The belly does not see soot. The tongue does not notice spilled water." The stranger's gaze grew fierce. The ancestors notice. Food without care is food without spirit. Do not forget, they eat not only what is cooked, but the reverence with which it is made. Before Nia could speak again, a wind swept through the village, lifting dust into the air. When it cleared, the stranger was gone. The drums began to beat as the feast started. Villagers dressed in bright cloth and beads gathered beneath the baobab. Hunters presented game, women carried baskets of fruit, and children sang songs of harvest. At last, Naya approached with her family's dish. The stew smelled rich, heavy with goat meat and herbs, yet the pot was blackened with soot, the stew thick and uneven, bits of husk floating in the broth. She placed it before the elders. The oldest among them, a man with skin lined like the bark of the baobab, tasted it. His face fell. He looked at the others, who tasted in silence. Then he said, "This dish is heavy with food but light with respect. The ancestors will not drink soot. They will not eat scattered husks. The spirit is not honored here." Whispers spread through the crowd. Some shook their heads. Others looked at Naya with pity. Her mother lowered her face, grief and shame weighing upon her shoulders. Naya's heart throbbed with humiliation. That night, unable to sleep, Naya walked to the river. The moonlight turned the water to silver. She dipped her hands into the stream and watched dirt cloud the surface, then saw how easily the current carried it away. She remembered the stranger's words, "Food without care is food without spirit." Nia wept. For the first time she understood, her neglect was not small. Every grain of millet was a gift of rain and soil. Every drop of water was the breath of life. To cook carelessly was to despise those gifts. From that day, Naya changed. She rose earlier, swept the hearth, and polished pots until they shone like bronze. She washed her hands carefully before touching food. She laid out utensils neatly, never rushing, never scattering. When she cooked, she sang soft songs to remind herself, "Clean hands, clear heart. Bright fire, humble art. Through the hearth the spirit feeds." At first, the villagers were skeptical, but over time they noticed. Her tea was always clear, never muddied. Her stews tasted of balance and respect. Travelers passing through would say, "Eat at Nia's hearth, and you will taste the sun, the soil, and the river in every bite." Her reputation spread until even chiefs sought her meals for ceremonies. Years turned, and Naya grew old. She became the teacher of the young girls, sitting beneath the great baobab with the children gathered at her feet. She told them of her shame, of the stranger who had come, and of the river that had taught her. Her words became a proverb on every tongue. Be clean and tidy when you make tea or meals, for through the hearth the spirit is fed. And long after she was gone, the villagers said that when the cooking fires burned neatly, when the pots gleamed and hands were washed, one could sometimes glimpse in the flicker of the flame a tall stranger in a grass cloak, smiling with ember-bright eyes. The fire burns low, and our stories come to an end. From old clothes treated with respect to meals prepared with clean hands and a careful heart, we've seen how wisdom weaves its way into the rhythm of life. May these tales stay with you as softly as the night wind. If you enjoyed this journey through ancient wisdom, I invite you to like and subscribe so you can join me again for more stories beneath the stars. Until then, may your dreams be peaceful and your spirit light. In the shadow of medieval abbeys and castles, words carried more weight than steel. A whispered rumor could ruin a life, and a woman's virtue was tested not only by her deeds, but by the silence she kept. Tonight, we follow the story of Evelyn, the widowed wife of a knight who stood against gossip, greed, and betrayal. Her path crossed with an exiled prince, corrupt monks, and a priest of quiet courage. And in the end, she faced a choice that would define her freedom. This is her story. Do not laugh or speak loudly. Do not listen to gossip. The vineyards of Burgundy rolled like green waves beneath the spring sun, dotted with villages that smelled of bread and smoke. Above them, on a gentle rise, stood the manor of Sir Alaric. Once this house had been alive with music and banners, knights boasting of their hunts, and ladies laughing as they embroidered. But that laughter had gone silent when word came from the east. Sir Alaric had fallen, cut down before Jerusalem's walls. His widow, Lady Evelyn, scarcely 20, now bore the manor's burdens alone. Her beauty was whispered of, though not with the crude admiration of tavern songs. She was no painted lady with jewels and perfumes, but one whose quiet grace lingered long after she left a room. She did not laugh loudly at feasts, nor chatter with her maids in corners. When villagers spoke of her, they said, "Her smile is softer than the dawn, her voice is calm as evening prayer." Yet that same restraint made her a subject of suspicion. Across the river, the abbey rose like a fortress of stone, its bells tolling at dawn and dusk. Once the monks had been known for their charity, feeding beggars and mending the sick. But wealth had changed them. The abbot now dined with dukes, his table laden with venison and silver goblets. The monks no longer tilled the soil, they counted coins in candlelit chambers. To the people they came robed in humility, cowls drawn low, their voices soft with prayer. But their eyes lingered too long on the fields, on the houses, and most of all, on the manor of Lady Evelyn. The widow was young, her beauty radiant even in mourning. She tended her land with fairness, her tenants with kindness, and though she lived with modesty, the monks saw only opportunity. They arrived often at her gate, offering blessings that came wrapped in chains of debt. "My lady," one would murmur, "have you considered gifting the abbey a strip of vineyard for the safety of your husband's soul?" Another would add, "A woman alone cannot manage such burdens. Better to entrust her lands to holy care." Evelyn listened in silence. She offered bread, she offered wine, but never consent. She held her manor with quiet dignity, and when they departed, their lips bent in piety, but their hearts burned with resentment. And so the whispers began, first in taverns, then in markets, until they seeped like rot through the village. The widow is proud. She keeps secrets. She denies the church its due. Some even whispered of hidden sins, of a lover she concealed, of coins stolen from tithe. The people, uncertain whom to believe, began to watch her with sidelong glances. A woman who spoke softly and kept her counsel now seemed suspicious. For in a world where words traveled faster than truth, silence was twisted into guilt. One evening, Eveline crossed the village square, her veil drawn low. She paused when two women, failing to see her, muttered together. It is said she cursed the abbot's men when they came for alms. Nay, worse, they say she feeds a heretic in her halls. Their laughter was nervous, tinged with fear. Eveline felt the sting, but she did not break her silence. She merely walked on, her steps steady, her eyes lifted toward the river where the abbey loomed, black against the setting sun. That night she prayed long in her chapel. She prayed not for her own safety, but for strength to endure without bitterness. Father Anselm, her only ally, found her there. "My child," he said softly, "the abbey grows fat on power. They cannot bear a woman who will not bend. But hold fast, your silence is your shield. Rumors are but smoke, and smoke cannot burn stone." Yet the abbey was not done. They sent men again, this time not with honeyed words but with threats. "Yield us your vineyards, or we shall bring your name before the bishop." Still Eveline refused. She offered them no angry retort, no tears to feed their triumph. And so the story spread wider, darker. They called her a sorceress now, a widow who kept her beauty through unholy charms. Some villagers crossed themselves at her passing, others avoided her gate. But Eveline's strength lay not in shouting down lies, but in outlasting them. She walked the same streets, gave alms with the same quiet hand, greeted her tenants with the same calm smile. Winter came heavy that year, the kind of cold that bit through stone walls and made even the hearth feel small against the dark. Snow lay deep along the valley road, and villagers trudged with lowered heads, breath rising like smoke into the gray sky. One evening, as dusk settled, Eveline's steward called from the gate. A traveler stood there, tall, cloaked, his boots caked in frozen mud, his face hidden beneath a hood rimed with frost. His voice was low, almost broken when he gave his name. Lucian. The steward's eyes widened. It was a name half whispered across the realm, a name shadowed by scandal. Lucian was the king's nephew, once a lord of proud estates, but banished when envy poisoned his uncle's heart. Betrayed at court, accused of treason, stripped of his title, he had wandered France like a beggar. His tale traveled ahead of him in fragments. Some said he had fled with rebels, others that he haunted taverns and woods, hunted like a wolf. Eveline stepped to the door, her lantern casting a circle of gold across the snow. Their eyes met, his hollow with exhaustion, hers steady and unreadable. She said nothing of the rumors she had heard, asked no questions of his disgrace. She only nodded and motioned him inside. By her hearth, he collapsed into the glow of the fire, the cloak falling back to reveal a face carved by hardship, but still noble in bearing. She offered bread, warm broth, and a place to rest. When he tried to speak, words faltering with shame, she lifted a hand. "You need no explanations here," she said quietly. Her silence was balm to him. He had grown sick of whispers, those courtly tongues that twisted every deed into deceit. In Eveline's hall, there was only the crackle of the fire, the creak of beams in the winter wind, and the calm presence of a woman who neither pried nor judged. The days that followed brought a strange peace. Lucian walked the manor grounds, helping where he could, mending a fence, carrying wood, even smiling faintly at the tenants' children who stared at him wide-eyed, sensing some hidden story. Eveline watched without comment, allowing him to shed, piece by piece, the weight of exile. But outside her walls, tongues still wagged. Word spread quickly that a stranger had come to the widow's hearth, tall and handsome, bearing himself like a knight. At the tavern, the whispers sharpened. She shelters a fugitive. The widow takes a lover. The abbey's monks seized the tale eagerly, fanning it into suspicion. Yet Eveline remained serene. At table, she spoke with Lucian of small things: the weather, the vineyards, the books in her late husband's library. Never of the past, never of his disgrace. He began to feel, for the first time in years, that he was more than a ruined name. And so in the heart of winter, two lives touched quietly across the gulf of loss: the widow who bore rumors with grace, and the exiled prince who had fled from lies. Neither sought to bind the other, yet in the stillness of Eveline's hall, both found the faint outline of freedom. The monks seized upon the gossip like wolves upon a carcass. What began as murmurs among villagers found eager mouths in the cloisters. In the refectory of the abbey, after prayers were mumbled and candles guttered low, They gathered in small, smoky chambers. The air reeked of incense and damp wool. Shadows from the hearth stretched long across the stone walls as the monks bent their heads close, voices weaving a net of slander. "She shelters him," hissed Brother Matthew, his eyes glittering with malice. "The king's nephew himself. I saw his bearing, no peasant carries himself so. She gives him bread, fire, perhaps her very bed." Brother Raoul, plump and red-cheeked from too much wine, leaned forward eagerly. "And what does that mean, brethren? It means she conspires. Widow though she is, she dares to set her hearth against the king, against Holy Church even. Is it not our duty to protect her soul, even if she resists?" A murmur of assent rippled around the chamber. Only one or two monks shifted uneasily, but none spoke against the rising tide. When their words alone could not satisfy, they carried them higher. Cloaked in the solemnity of duty, a deputation of 3 approached the bishop in his hall, robes still damp from the fog that clung to the riverbank. The bishop, gray and sharp-eyed, sat beneath a crucifix while clerks scratched notes by the light of tall candles. The monks bowed, then spoke with rehearsed gravity. "My lord," said Matthew, his voice smooth as oil, "we come bearing a matter most grave. Lady Evelyn harbors a dangerous guest, Lucien, the exiled blood of the crown. She offers him her protection, her table, perhaps more. To the common folk it is already a scandal. To the king it will be treason." Brother Raoul crossed himself piously before adding, "She defies both crown and church. She gathers whispers in her hall, and if left unchecked, those whispers will swell into rebellion." The bishop's quill paused mid-scratch, his gaze lifted, heavy as a hammer. "Are these idle rumors," he asked slowly, "or accusations you would swear before the altar of God?" The monks exchanged quick glances. Then one by one they nodded. "We swear it." And so what had begun as idle chatter by firelight grew heavier with each retelling, until it took the weight of law. What had been gossip twisted into accusation, and accusation shaped itself into the likeness of a noose, its rope tightening invisibly around Evelyn's neck. The abbey struck when the first buds of spring appeared. One night, torches flared against the sky. A mob of monks and hired men stormed the manor gates, shouting of treachery. "Yield the prince! Yield the widow!" Steel clashed, servants screamed, the air thick with smoke. But Father Anselm stood at the chapel door, his frail body straight as a spear. Cross raised high, he thundered, "This house is not yours. You come with lies, not with law. By God's truth, I forbid you." For a moment, even hardened mercenaries faltered before his fury. Meanwhile, Evelyn acted with calm urgency. She remembered the secret passage beneath the manor, built long ago by Sir Alaric in times of war. With steady voice, she guided Lucien, her household, and terrified villagers into the dark tunnels. Her steps never quickened, her tone never shook. It was her composure, not the stone walls, that kept panic at bay. They emerged in the forest miles away, the manor lost to fire and plunder. For days they wandered, through bramble, mud, and storm. Evelyn's soft hands blistered, her gown torn, yet she tended to the wounded, shared the last crusts of bread, and comforted children with songs. Evelyn bore it with the same composure as always. She did not protest with shrill cries, nor argue in the markets. In those moments, her modesty became strength, her silence a rallying cry. Lucien, hardened by exile, found himself humbled. "You speak less than any queen I have known," he told her by the campfire. "Yet you lead as though God himself walks beside you." "I thought silence was weakness," he confessed. "But yours is like a sword. It cuts sharper than words." At last they reached the borderlands, where the forest thinned and the land opened into windswept heaths. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and frost, and the gray horizon seemed to stretch endlessly, as though freedom itself began just beyond the ridgeline. There, hidden in a hollow between ancient oaks, Lucien's loyal knights awaited in secret. Their cloaks were ragged from months of hiding, their armor dulled by mud and rain, yet their eyes gleamed with fierce devotion when they beheld their master. Evelyn felt the earth shift beneath her heart, for before her lay 2 paths. She could return to Burgundy, to the cold stone halls of her manor, where the abbey's shadow loomed over her life like a gallows. There she would be hostage still, to whispers and envy, to the abbot's greed, to a life hemmed in by rumor. Or she could walk forward, across the invisible line of exile, beside Lucien. The road promised no safety, no certainty, but it promised freedom. It was then that Father Anselm, who had ridden quietly behind their company all these days, stepped forward from his mule. The wind tugged at his worn cloak, his tonsured head bowed as though in thought. "My daughter," he said softly, his voice carrying more weight than all the clamor of monks and bishops behind them. "The world will always murmur. Men will always find stones to cast. But the Lord does not measure you by gossip, nor by what courts or abbots decree. He measures you by the courage of your love and by the truth you choose." Evelyn's eyes stung as she turned toward him. In his face, lined with years of care and prayer, she saw none of the malice that had haunted her in the abbey, none of the greed that drove its brothers. She saw only the quiet, stubborn goodness of a shepherd who had chosen to walk with his flock into danger rather than abandon them. Lucien extended his hand, the faintest tremor in it betraying the uncertainty of a man who had lost everything but hope. Around them, the nights shifted, expectant. The wind howled across the heath, as if urging decision. Evelyn closed her eyes. She thought of her manor, its hearths grown cold beneath the weight of slander. She thought of the abbey's eyes upon her, waiting for her to stumble. Then she thought of the hearth she had shared with Lucien, the silence they had kept, the peace it had brought. When she opened her eyes, there was no hesitation left. She placed her hand in his. "Then I will not return," she said, her voice steady. "I will go with you." Father Anselm traced the sign of the cross in the air, his voice a low prayer carried by the wind. "May this choice lead not to change, but to the freedom God intended." And so Evelyn stepped across the border, not merely of Burgundy, but of her old life, into exile, into peril, and into a freedom more profound than safety had ever been. And so, in old songs, she was remembered, not as a woman who laughed loudly in halls, nor one who lent her ear to gossip, but as the widow whose quiet smile defied the abbey's greed, whose silence sheltered a prince, and whose modesty lit the road to freedom. Thank you for joining this journey into a tale of whispers, faith, and courage. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more wisdom brought to life through legend and history, please give this video a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next tale we share. Until then, keep wisdom close and stories closer.